Dr. Alex Plato is going to start us off. He's here at the Franciscan University of Steubenville in the philosophy department. I'll speak next, building on what he said, and then Dr. Susan Waldstein will build on what the two of us say. So without further ado, Dr. Plato.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to the rest of this conference. And what I want to do today is, first of all, assure you that my last name really is Plato. I didn't choose that. The fates chose that. So I don't know whether that's a virtuous name or a vicious name, but we'll see. But I'm going to be mostly covering Aristotle today. I want to give you kind of an overview of his system of the virtue tradition. So this is care of the soul in the ancient classical sort of way, mostly Plato and Aristotle. So, well, why the virtue tradition now? Let me say a few words about that. Where are we at in our culture? When I think about where we're at thinking in terms of ethics, I see that we think mostly in terms of rules and laws, codes of conduct, and those are good, but those have their limitations. You can't ever specify enough rules, as you know, but also when you think about rules, you focus on actions rather than patterns of actions, inclinations for actions, dispositions, and in short, character. So we tend to get distracted from issues of character when we think only in terms of rules and codes of conduct. So I want to then talk about the language we use when we talk about morality, since we have this sort of rules, code of conduct sort of culture. But with in mind that language is a sort of barometer of culture. So when language changes in certain ways, culture has changed in certain ways. And there can be a kind of feedback loop in either direction there. We might change the language first, and then the culture changes, then the language changes, but they always kind of go together. So here's some typical moral language that I've heard describing good and bad character, the moral character of someone. Well, he's unselfish, or he's selfish, okay? Or he's nice and he's not nice, okay? Or he's smart or he's stupid, or he's so positive or he's so negative, or just simply he's good and he's evil. Well, these terms, they're all fine. There's nothing wrong with those, but there's a kind of thinness to those words. They don't have much descriptive content. For example, even unselfish, selfish. I can think of two examples of people who are unselfish, right, but they're actually doing bad things, right? So the Nazi guard, right, who's mowing down Jews, right, might be staying after hours, right, and thinking, you know what, I'm just going to do this for the duty of my country, right? And he's, his hands are bleeding from holding the machine gun, right? And he's saying, I'm not going to see my wife and children for longer because I'm going to, duty to the fatherland or whatever. Well, he might be being unselfish in that respect, but clearly that's wicked. Or the person who's sort of the doormat. They just do whatever everybody else says, right? But they don't take care of themselves. Those would be unselfish, but not good, okay? Or selfish. Sometimes selfishness, in a certain sense, is good, right? So here at Franciscan University, a student might go up to another student and say, hey, you want to go to a prayer group? And the other student says, well, no, I have to do my homework, right? And they say, well, hey, that's kind of selfish. You should care more about God and prayer and religious things. Right, and the person might respond, well, actually, I'm here to be a student, right? I need to be wise, I need to be prudent, right? So they might be taking care of their own affairs, in a certain sense, selfish, but that's a good thing. Selfish, unselfish, not that great of a category. How about some of these other ones, nice and not nice? Well, what's a better way to talk about that? Well, how about kind and unkind? There's more content there. Or positive and negative. He's so positive, or he's so negative. Well, how about the idea of cheerful and dreary? There's more content to these ideas. Or again, good, evil, how about loving and malicious? Those seem to convey a lot more information. Here's some typical language when we describe action. We often say when we disapprove of something, well, that's wrong. And if somebody says, well, what do you mean by wrong? You're like, well, I don't know, it's just wrong, right? And so that tends to end the conversation, right? It ends the moral inquiry. Whereas suppose somebody says, well, that's unjust. Right? You're like, well, what do you mean? Then you have to describe somehow there's some unfairness, there's some right violated, something more specific, or maybe say that's foolish, right? Or that's careless, or that's greedy, or that's unchaste, or that's impure, or that's malicious. Those all convey more specific and thick content than just that's wrong. Okay? There's another a deeper reason why our moral language that's overly associated with codes of conduct and laws is a problem. Because we live in a culture that in some senses is post-Christian. And so in Christianity, we had the development of a law kind of based ethics where we understood these terms about what we morally ought to do or we morally ought not to do, what's morally wrong or morally right, and had to do with the Ten Commandments, God's law. But when our culture faded away from that kind of way of thinking about things and many of us act as if there is no God, then that language loses a lot of its meaning, if not all of its meaning. whereas the virtue tradition, right, is connected, I think, to all the different traditions of mankind. As you can see on your handout, the really, really grainy list of tons of words, right, is taken from lots of different traditions over lots of different time. And you see there's a very rich vocabulary describing people that are good or people that are bad, right? Now the question is, why organize a list in this way? Well, this one's alphabetical, but you can see in each one of these lines, there's three. Okay, there's a bolder one in the middle, which is the virtue term. And then on either side, there's another term, which is the extremes or the vices on either side. So this list follows Aristotle's doctrine of the mean in trying to organize our virtue and vice language. So what I'm suggesting is that one way to recover virtue is just learn how to use the vocabulary well. And if we did that, that would go a long way. We don't have to know all the theories. We don't have to know all the justifications. We don't have to be able to talk on the level of professional moral philosophers. That might be good in some ways. It might be bad in other ways. Okay? But what we need to do is master this vocabulary for, first of all, for ourselves, our own self-understanding. So when I was in college, I didn't have any of this language, and I described to people that I got conted. So what I thought in terms of duties, right? So if I'm not a murderer, and I'm not an adulterer, right, and I don't steal things, well, I'm a good person. I just don't do these bad things. So I thought only in terms of rules. Whereas later on in my life, I came to face or confront Aristotle's way of thinking and the whole virtue tradition. And one example of that is I had this old prayer book, an Anglo-Catholic prayer book called St. Augustine's prayer book, not St. Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine of Canterbury. And in this prayer book, there's this rich language that works with the 7 deadly sins. And I started reading that, and all of a sudden I realized all these pockets of bad inclinations, dispositions, feelings inside of myself that had nothing to do with particular actions, but had to do with certain patterns of feelings. And so then I had a rich vocabulary to describe myself. And so I could then start confronting myself and what's actually evil, the roots of evil in me. So this language became all of a sudden extremely useful to me understanding myself. So those are some examples of why I think we need the virtue tradition today, for self-understanding and to build up our culture again as a moral culture. So the lesson there is we need to just learn the words and the vocabulary. Okay, so what I want to do now really quickly is I want to cover, if I can, 6 different topics that come from Aristotle's ethics. I want to cover his teleological conception of the good. I want to cover his idea of eudaimonia, which is translated happiness, his definition of happiness, his definition of virtue, which comes to that handout on the doctrine of the mean, the idea of contemplation, God, and ethics. And then last, I want to apply this using a lesson from the reading in your reader from Plato's Gorgias, where Socrates accuses Callicles of neglecting geometry. So I want to end by telling you, don't neglect geometry. Okay, that's where we're headed, okay? Just so in case you want to know. Okay, so what's the teleological conception of the good? So in the first quotation that I have on the Aristotle Basics reading on 22 of your reader, Aristotle begins this most famous ethics book of all time, at least in the West. He says, every art and every inquiry and every action and every pursuit is thought to aim at some good, and for this reason the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim. So put it this way, the teleological conception of the good is the idea that the good is the goal. The goal is the good. Okay, and that's absolutely fundamental to Aristotle's ethics, and not only Aristotle, but Plato has that conception too. And so that's the teleological conception of the good. I don't want to dwell on it too much right now because we have only a short time, but I want you to bear that in mind. That's how Aristotle begins his ethics, and then he's going to go from there. So the next thing Aristotle does in this book, Nicomachean Ethics, is he supposes that his intended reader will think there really is a supreme good. So he says, if then there is some end or goal of the things which we all do, which we desire for its own sake, everything else being desired for that thing, and if we do not choose everything for the sake of something else, for at that rate, the process would go on to infinity, and so that a desire would be empty and vain, clearly this must be the good and the chief good. So he's assuming that his readers have now supposed there is one. But note this, he hasn't described it at all. You can know that there's an ultimate or supreme good without being able to describe it perfectly. Right? Or even generally, because actions can be ordered by means and ends, and so all of our actions, we try to order our life to a certain end. We can apply that pattern, right, to our own life, our own stream of actions in their order. Okay, so he supposes that. Then he says certain things about the nature of the student. the nature of the student of ethics, so who he's writing to in the Nicomachean Ethics. He says, first of all, that the purpose of studying the good, or the end, is not just to know it. If that's what you thought, you're in a bad place. The purpose of trying to study this is to become good. So he says this, he says, our present discussion does not aim, as our others do, at study, for the purpose of our examination is not to know what virtue is, but to become good, since otherwise the inquiry would be of no benefit to us. In fact, if you just wanted to know what the good is without being interested in doing it, your study of it would actually make you more wicked and evil. Okay? So then you'd know perfectly how to pretend to be a good person, right? You'd make a perfect Machiavellian, okay? So you need to check yourself, so to speak. That's what Aristotle wants you to do, and realize, hey, I need to want to become good if this study is going to be any benefit to me at all. Okay? So the other thing he says about the subject of study here, the subject of ethics, is since it's about, he says, since it's about fine and just actions, or beautiful and right actions, he says those admit of much variety and fluctuation of opinion, so that they may be thought to exist only by convention. So he's saying people think that relativism is true back then just as well as now. And he says, and they don't exist by nature. He says, we must be content then in speaking of such subjects to indicate the truth roughly and in outline, for it is the mark of an educated man to look for precision in each class of things, just so far as the nature of the subject admits. So if you thought you were going to get mathematical precision in ethics, right, you're off on the wrong foot. You're not going to get that kind of precision. But that doesn't mean we can't know more about it. We can't fill in an outline. Okay. So he discusses, just like Plato discusses, that we have the nature of the good, and it's like a target for us to aim at. They both use this idea of a target, both Plato and Aristotle, in the readings that I gave you. I'm going to skip over that quotation just for now, but I want you to know that they think of it, we need to know about it so that we can hit the target. Okay? Now, back to square one, the very first line of the Nicomachean Ethics. Every craft, every line of inquiry, and likewise every action seems to seek some good. That's why we call that the good. But then the next line, which isn't in your reader, says this, but the ends that are sought appear to differ. Some are activities and others are products apart from the activities. So now we have two different types of goals that Aristotle has made a distinction between. The first one, we might call it an instrumental goal. That's where there's a product. Let's say I'm a shipbuilder and my purpose of being a shipbuilder is the ship, building a good ship. It's separable from shipbuilding. Okay? So that's an instrumental goal. The other some people call an autotelic goal. So the purpose, the telos, is within the activity itself. You might say that the purpose of the activity is the perfection of the activity. So think about, for example, a symphony. The purpose of a symphony isn't to finish the last note. That's not the purpose. The purpose is in the symphony itself, the form of the symphony, you might say, the perfection of itself. There's a standard within, right, a certain kind of symphony for the perfection of that symphony. Okay? So now we can ask the central question, I think, of the Nicomachean Ethics. Since the intended students, who in this case are you, right, suppose that human life is seeking some chief good, we can ask, well, is human life, that is human activity, is it seeking a good that's internal to the activity, an autotelic goal, or is it seeking something that's apart from the activity, some product? Okay? So is human activity itself more like a symphony with a standard internal to it, or is it more like a road trip where the purpose is, you get there in the end? Okay? So, for example, is the purpose of human activity something external that we choose, like, let's say, the American dream? Well, we'll eventually get there if we have enough money, enough goods, whatever, enough balance of such things. Or is it something internal that we don't choose? It's just in the nature of our activity because it's human activity. Is it already there? Or is it something we just choose to put there? Okay? So Aristotle and Plato before him think that human activity has an internal purpose or goal, and that's called eudaimonia. Okay? So that's translated a lot of different ways. That Greek term has a big semantic range. Okay? Sometimes it's translated flourishing. So a flourishing life. That's the internal goal of human activity, is to flourish. Or to thrive, to be blessed, well-being, doing well, living well, happiness. These are all ways to translate eudaimonia. And I think that we need to recognize this semantic range, because if we just read the ethics and we see the word happiness, we might be misled by that because of how we Americans tend to use the idea of happiness as well. I'm happy today. Yesterday I had a bad hair day. I wasn't happy. Happiness is sort of this episodic thing that comes and goes. But for Aristotle, eudaimonia is much more deeply rooted in your life, in your character, in the patterns of activity and feeling that you have. Okay. So we've got happiness or eudaimonia as the chief good, but what is it? So Aristotle's Ethics wants to then spell that out. Okay. So he wants to define it this way. He wants to define it as an activity. Well, think about this. An activity, you might say, is the exercise of an ability or the exercise of a capacity, right? Well, certain things have different powers or capacities based on their natures, right? Horses have different powers than dogs, right? Squid have different powers than eagles, right? They have different natures, so they have different powers. So their activities are going to be different types. Okay? So we've got nature or type of thing, powers, activity, sort of like a layer cake. Okay, let's call it the metaphysical layer cake. Right. So to have perfect nature would be to have perfect powers, which perfectly manifest perfect activity for your type of nature. Okay. So if we're going to define happiness as human activity, it's going to be intrinsically related to human powers and human nature. Okay. So if, let's say we made up a verb, to human, okay? It's not a real verb, but let's say we made that up, it would be something like defined as act rationally in thinking and choosing. So if there was such a verb as to human, it would be defined as act rationally in thinking and choosing. Now we're apt to misunderstand that because our notion of rationality has been somewhat corrupted. But let's suppose we just bear that in mind as we're thinking about it. Here's a description by the philosopher Peter Geach of what rationality is like in human life. Okay? He says this, it would take an immensely long description to cover even roughly the activities manifesting rational capacities or powers or abilities that men can acquire. Most of these have some close connection with language, but they extend far further than linguistic performances. What I give here is a mere sampling: the composition of music, the invention of forms of dance and ceremonial, the building of houses and other structures whereby men become able to live in varied and very mutable climates and not confined to a particular ecological niche like any other animals. The mastery of fire and flames as a means of heating and lighting, but which also serve for preparing foodstuffs and other materials for human needs. The playing according to the rules of all manner of games, athletic and intellectual, the devising of human methods and standards of measurement, the devising of tools and machines for all sorts of purposes under human handling, the devising of instructions of observations that supplement human sense organs, the devising of means of transport by land and seas and now in the air and space too, the preservation of traditions about ancestors, about the past generally, so that the inventions and discoveries of one generation are not lost to later generations, the use of language, not just for messages about immediate environment, but for telling stories and other speculations about the origin and nature of the world we live in, all manner of representative arts, and finally, activities aimed at getting into contact with some superior being or beings who can govern the course of man's world and grant his petitions. Such are the rational activities. We may see and hear them all around us, the huge difference that they make in our environment. Many of these activities are to be found in human culture, any human culture, not just cultures we call civilized. And on this point, on this planet, man is the rational animal. No productions or activities of the other animals remotely compare with those of man. Denials of human uniqueness are mere sophistry, laughable or pitiable. So here's rationality. It's a very varied thing. Okay? It manifests itself on all these modes of human life. So when we're talking about to human, this special verb that Aristotle's interested in, we're talking about activities that manifest human nature, human rationality. Okay. So let me get to the definition of happiness and the definition of virtue. Okay, and I'll have to stop there, I think. So Aristotle defines happiness famously as an activity of the soul in accord with virtue. So happiness is defined in terms of virtue. The good is defined in terms of virtue. So you might say there's an intrinsic relationship between virtue and happiness. It's not that first we figure out what happiness is. First we figure out what the good is from some theoretical height, and then we go figure out what the virtues are. Right? We already have a great understanding of what the virtues are, and we just need to systematize it, be more careful, see the inner order of them, right? And then we can have a better understanding of happiness. Remember our target we're aiming at? We can focus on it if we understand virtue. Okay? So he says this next. He says, since happiness is a certain sort of activity of the soul in accord with complete virtue, we must examine virtue. No duh. Okay? For that, perhaps that would be a way to study happiness better. Right. Okay. So let's make some quick applications. So eudaimonia, or happiness, it can't be achieved by simply acquiring sufficient wealth, pleasure, honor, or some mix of those, as in the American dream, for example. Why not? Well, those are external goods, not internal goods. Remember how we started out the whole ethics? Happiness is an internal good in the activity of human nature itself. Well, okay. So eudaimonia, however, doesn't exclude these things. These things are not irrelevant, right? But they don't have an intrinsic relationship, okay, to happiness. So ethics, according to Aristotle, is the art of character. It's not about rules and codes of conduct, although he will absolutely apply it to those later. It's first of all about the nature of human character. So he defines virtue in this way. By virtue, I mean virtue of character. This is about feeling and actions that admit of excess, deficiency, and an intermediate condition. But having these feelings at the right times, about the right things, toward the right people, for the right end, in the right way, is the intermediate or best condition as proper to virtue. So if you look at that handout I gave you on the doctrine of the mean, right? You've got this, the center of that handout is a curved line, okay? So sometimes when we think about the mean, if you've ever heard of that before, sometimes it's drawn as a straight line. You've got, here's an extreme over here, here's an extreme over here, and there's a middle point. So let's say we're talking about anger. Here's your super anger all the time, here's your never anger in the middle, sort of like some middle amount of anger. So that's what the mean means, like just a middle amount of anger, right? Well, that's not the way Aristotle thinks about it, right? Because if somebody did a grave injustice in front of you and just had a little bit of anger, something's wrong with your feelings, right? There's such a thing as righteous indignation, okay? Similarly with sadness, right? It's not like here's a whole bunch of sadness here and here's no sadness here and here's the middle amount, that's virtuous. So like your cat dies, right? And you have, you know, a middle amount of sadness, so you're virtuous. Well, what about if some relative of yours dies, somebody really close that you love, and you just have a middle amount of sadness? Something's wrong with you. That's not the right amount of sadness for that situation. Okay, so we can't make this spectrum and think of it as just an intensity of feelings. We all have just a middle amount of intensity. He described the mean as the right feeling at the right time about the right thing toward the right people. And so if you look at that curve, that condition is only one tiny point on the top of that curve. It's really easy to miss that, okay? That's his point, okay? And so we have to adjust our actions to the entire circumstances and to have to relate to the agent in the right way. So you might say that the goodness of a human person and his action is this vast harmony of all the circumstances, the type of action, and the agent. It's sort of like a beautiful artwork, okay? Okay, I need to end now, so let me say one thing about God and Aristotle's transition to that in the Eudaimonia ethics. So when he gets in the very end of Nicomachean Ethics and he says, we've been talking about happiness, what is that? We've talked about virtue, we've talked about friendship, we've talked about pleasure, we've talked about pain, we've covered all these topics. And then he says, well, what is this sort of activity? What's the best way to define the highest activity of human beings? He says it's theorein is the Greek word, which is contemplation. So he says contemplation of God, contemplation of divine things is the highest part of our rationality. So then he applies this in the reading you had in the Eudaimonia Ethics. If we act in any way that frustrates the contemplation of the divine, then our action's bad. We can know that even if we can't completely specify the good, or if we can't define every virtue, okay? We can still know that. So last, neglecting geometry. So again, if human goodness is sort of this harmony with the circumstances, the agent, the action related to all natures, other persons in a certain way, you need to not neglect the idea of proportion and harmony in the natures of things. So when Socrates says, hey, Callicles, you neglect geometry, he means you don't understand the proportions and order within reality itself, and you're not fitting in it. So that's why we shouldn't neglect geometry. We should see the proportions in all of reality. So study of reality, contemplation of reality, the orders, the patterns, the natures, all this, becoming a kind of having artistic vision of reality makes you, right, more attuned to moral goodness as well. So moral goodness and beauty come together in a certain special way. I think that's the lesson there. So I better stop now because I'm over time. But thanks for your attention, and I'll turn it over to the next presenter.
All right, thank you, Dr. Plato. I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that Dr. Plato covered, as well as some of the themes that Dr. Crosby covered this morning. And in particular, I want to call attention to one thing that Dr. Crosby said, which is the idea that ethics is always rooted in anthropology. And that's something that we saw out of Dr. Plato's talk as well. If we're going to understand what human happiness is, the goal of human life, if we're going to understand what virtuous action is, then we need to know what we are. It always gets tied back to that. We just heard this definition of eudaimonia, that it involves activity in accord with the mean. Right? And we heard that the mean has something to do with this balance, having this proper proportion within human powers, human activities, human feelings. The later tradition, the Latin scholastic tradition, who in your reading packet is represented by St. Thomas Aquinas, describes a virtue as what they call a habitus. This sometimes gets translated as habit, and just like the word happiness can be misleading, this word habit can also be misleading. A lot of times I think we think of a habit as like you have a habit to brush your teeth, you have a habit, I don't know, to smoke or whatever. It's like it's something you regularly do. Right? But a habitus isn't just something that you regularly do. When you have the habitus of, say, courage or cowardice, it's not just that you regularly do courageous actions or that you regularly do cowardly actions. A habitus involves a sort of formation of your powers, thinking, feeling, willing, such that they aim at a particular goal. A habit, in the sense of a habitus, is not merely something you do by rote. Rather, it is something that you willingly and freely and rationally do, and where you have a tendency, where your character has been formed in such a way that you have that movement towards rationally and freely doing that particular action. So we call virtues habits in that sense. The tradition has identified, following Plato and also to Aristotle to some extent, 4 main virtues. Temperance, which is a virtue about pleasures. It's where you have the right feeling at the right time in the right way about pleasure. Courage, which is the mean about pains or difficulties. You have the right tendency at the right time, in the right places, to act with respect to difficulties so that you face them in the right way. Justice, which is a virtue about external actions. You have the tendency in your actions with regard to others to give them their due, to give them what they deserve. And finally, prudence, which is an intellectual virtue. It's the tendency to think properly about what you ought to do. And the tradition has generally regarded, following Aristotle, as prudence as necessary for all those moral virtues. If you can't think properly about what you ought to do, you're not going to be able to act properly in those situations regarding pleasure or pain or external actions, which is every situation we face. So keep all that in mind. A habitus, a virtue, is a formation of all of our powers in a particular direction, in that teleological way that Dr. Plato identified. I want to shift a little bit now, and we've heard a lot of sort of constructive aspects of the virtue tradition, right? Thinking about adopting a certain language, learning about what the goal of human life is and how we can form ourselves in that way. But if we're going to understand the tradition on virtue, which is what this panel is supposed to be about, we also need to know what the problems are. What are some sort of theoretical problems that arise when we think about forming our character such that it aims at that mean that Dr. Plato talked about? If you want to understand a tradition about anything at all, you need to know what are the problems that have been identified in that tradition. What are the issues that need to be solved? And I want to just mention a couple very briefly. We can talk about them more in the question and answer period or at another time. The first problem that arises in the tradition is it seems that human beings have multiple ends. There are multiple ways in which we can flourish. Aristotle, for example, identifies 2 competing ends in human life. On the one hand, it looks like we aim at the contemplation of God. Moral virtue helps form us in such a way that we can contemplate better. We can form virtues in our intellect such that we think well, contemplate well, perceive well, and so move ourselves towards knowledge of God. On the other hand, it looks like a lot of our moral virtues aim at political flourishing, flourishing in the context of the state, the human community, where we use our mind and our feelings and our actions and so forth to aim at the well-being of the community. And these are in tension to some extent. Right? The more time you spend contemplating God, the less time you have to engage in political action, and vice versa. So it looks like we aim at two sorts of flourishing there. The Christian tradition, again with people like St. Thomas Aquinas, adds a further wrinkle to this. Here we seem to have a difference between what we can call our natural happiness and our supernatural happiness. So on the one hand, by nature, we seem capable of certain sorts of activities. Right? We can engage in those political activities. We can engage in moral action with respect to one another. We can contemplate God insofar as we can know him by our natural abilities alone. Right? But then, through grace, through the Christian life, we can aim at supernatural happiness, contemplating God in himself, in the beatific vision. So we need to know, how are we going to put together these various conceptions of happiness? Right? There's just one thing here, with one nature. What exactly is it supposed to aim at? Which of these ends is supposed to be the ultimate end? So that's a first problem. And I don't want to necessarily give solutions to these problems here. I just want to put my finger on what are the problems we need to think about if we're going to understand virtue better. Second problem comes out of that. I mentioned earlier those cardinal virtues: prudence, temperance, courage, justice. The Christian tradition then identifies some additional virtues. Right? Professor Seifert talked about faith earlier. In addition, we can talk about hope and charity, right? What we call the theological virtues. Right? So a further problem is, how do we put together the cardinal virtues with the theological virtues? And one important problem here is we form the cardinal virtues by habituation. Right? That is, in order to become courageous, I don't just start off courageous. I have to make myself act in a courageous way. Right? You can think of Aristotle's ethics as the fake it till you make it ethics. Right? I got to make myself act as if I were courageous until I become courageous, until it becomes, as he puts it, second nature to me. And I have that rational tendency to act in that way. So the tradition has called these acquired virtues. I acquire them by my own activity. On the other hand, virtues like faith, hope, and charity, I can't acquire them. Right? I can't make myself act in a faithful way and eventually become faithful. And that's because these are supernatural virtues. They're above and beyond what I'm capable of doing under my own power. Rather, the Christian tradition has said we receive these virtues by infusion. God has to put them into your soul. Right? This relates to this idea of the care of the soul that God does for us that Professor Seifert talked about earlier. Furthermore, the Christian tradition has by and large held that when we're baptized, God infuses into us the moral virtues as well. So we get infused courage, infused temperance, infused justice. So we have this problem then. On the one hand, it looks like we can acquire virtue by our own power. On the other hand, it looks like, according to the Christian tradition at least, God puts virtues into us. Right? But of course, a baby who gets baptized, or even an adult who gets baptized, isn't suddenly automatically courageous. That is, they don't suddenly automatically act in a courageous way, or a charitable way, or anything like this. So we have this problem. What's the relationship between acquired and infused virtue? And furthermore, how is it that we can have virtues infused into us and yet they don't manifest themselves in our lives? So this is important to think about because it relates to this anthropological business that Dr. Crosby talked about. How exactly is my soul being formed? How exactly are my powers for thinking, feeling, acting, and so forth being formed when I habituate myself versus when God acts upon me? So that's a further problem one needs to think about. A second problem here that comes out in the reading that I gave to you from St. Thomas Aquinas is the problem of how the virtues are connected. So if we're going to think about virtue and about how to become virtuous, we need to think about whether in order to have one virtue, you need the others as well. Thomas Aquinas makes a couple of important distinctions here that are important to keep in mind as we're going forward in this seminar. First, there's a distinction we can make between what we might call natural virtue and what we might call genuine or rational virtue. So some people are born courageous in the sense that they're not scared of things, right? They don't have that natural fearfulness that many of us have about things. So they're born with that tendency to be courageous. The question then is that a genuine virtue, a genuine habitus that moves them towards their end? And people like Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas say no. If you're just acting on instinct, so to speak, if you're just acting on the basis of what you're naturally inclined to do, you don't yet have that virtue. Remember, virtue involves reason, it involves freedom. You got to know what you're choosing and freely choose it, and then develop that disposition, that habit to tend to rationally and freely act in that way. So first question here in connection with this issue of unity among the virtues is the question of what's the relationship between natural and rational virtue? Is having that initial inclination helpful for becoming, say, genuinely courageous? Or is it actually in some way a hindrance? Because I don't have to think about it. I'm naturally disposed to not be fearful. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to freely choose to act in that way. Does that actually hinder me from developing genuine rational virtue? So that's a first problem here. Second problem is the problem of the connection among the virtues, sort of properly speaking. In order for me to have one genuine virtue, do I have to have the others as well? That is, in order for me to be really courageous, must I also be temperate? We can probably think of lots of people who seem to be courageous, right? They go into, say, a battlefield situation and they're able to face up to the dangers there, do their duty, right? But when they're off the battlefield, they're not temperate. Right? Say they're drink too much alcohol or whatever it might be. The question then is, do they genuinely have courage, given that they clearly don't have temperance? And again, Thomas Aquinas makes a helpful distinction here between imperfect and perfect virtues. You can have a sort of rational tendency to act well in a certain respect without having that tendency to act well in other respects. But that can't be the perfection of the virtues, Aquinas says. In order for me to be perfectly virtuous, I've got to have my whole soul proportioned, like Dr. Plato talked about. That is, all my feelings, my ability to think about what I ought to do, my ability to freely choose what to do, they've all got to be in balance with one another. Right? So that as a whole person, I aim at what's good. Others, though, in the tradition are going to disagree with that and say, no, you can have isolated virtues without the others. A final problem here is one that Professor Plato alluded to also when he talked about the situation of the Nazi, the unselfish Nazi, who unselfishly devotes himself to committing genocide. So the question there is it possible to use virtues to do what is evil? Can I use my courage, right, a genuine rational tendency to choose to face up to dangerous situations in the right way? Can I use that virtue to do what is bad? Right? Could there be a genuinely courageous Nazi, to use this example? And again, the tradition by and large is going to say no. We might have the natural virtue of courage. We might have that imperfect virtue of courage. But the perfect virtue, again, requires that balance, that harmony, that beauty of all of my powers working in concert with one another. Okay, last point I want to make very briefly. So we've seen there's a number of problems here. We have a last issue, which is the issue of how to organize all the virtues. So Dr. Plato gave us this list of lots and lots of virtues. Right? I just gave you a very short list of 7 virtues, those 4 cardinal virtues and those 3 theological virtues. So if virtue is a harmony among the different parts of the soul, the different powers that I have by nature, that gives me a tendency to seek the good. If I'm going to understand what it is to be virtuous, I need to understand how all these different tendencies relate to one another. This issue of organizing the virtues and figuring out how they relate to each other isn't just an academic exercise. It's something everybody has to reflect on if you're going to really become virtuous. Right? That is, I need to know, how is it that my kindness should relate to my courage, should relate to my mercy and my prudence, and so forth. And the way the tradition has dealt with this problem is with the idea of sub-virtues, or parts of virtue. The idea here is we've got these basic tendencies that we ought to develop. Temperance, to deal with pleasure well. Courage, to deal with pain well. Justice, to deal with external action well. And prudence, to deal with practical thinking well. And all the other tendencies that we can develop are, as it were, different ways of living out those particular initial virtues. So I gave, for example, in the reading, the virtue of religion. Religion is the virtue whereby I give God his due. This is a part of justice. We should think of it as an aspect of that virtue of justice. By the virtue of religion, by developing this habitual, rational tendency to pray, to offer sacrifice, to have gratitude towards God, have reverence, and so forth, I am living out that virtue of justice in a particular way. And again, last point I want to make is just to tie back to that initial point. We always need to think of these virtues as rooted in our nature and powers. When you're thinking about the moral life, we have to always think about what kind of a thing am I? What sorts of abilities do I have? And what do those abilities aim at? A virtuous habit is going to be one that helps me aim at those goods well, and a vicious habit is one that's going to take me away from those goods that I aim at by nature. All right, I want to turn it over now to Dr. Waldstein, who's going to talk about another sub-virtue, magnanimity.
Magnanimity. Greatness of soul. So it comes, our English word comes from the Latin magna, great, anima, soul, or great-heartedness. The opposing vice would be small-souled, mean-minded. According to Aristotle, the magnanimous man desires and does great things, great deeds worthy of honor. Aristotle thinks of magnanimity as a kind of crowning virtue because only the man who already has all the other virtues can be magnanimous, because only the man who is virtuous deserves honor. And the magnanimous man acts well with respect to honor. He wishes the honor due to him because he wishes to do great and honorable deeds. He doesn't do great deeds for the sake of honor, but because they are noble. However, he accepts happily honor from the virtuous because honor is a good thing, and because it's good for his fellow citizens, because by honoring him, they can share in his great deeds. Now, the great deeds all flow from other virtues, but become magnanimous because of their scale. So a man is courageous who faces the enemy in a battle. He's magnanimous when he, with 199 other men, defend a narrow pass against 100,000 soldiers until they all die. So magnanimous deeds are going to be noble deeds from all the virtues, but with a certain scale of grandeur. Something like the way the liberal man or open-handed man deals well with money. He's happy to have money because he gives it away. He likes to give it away to good people and good causes. But the magnificent man or the munificent man is the one who does enormous benevolent acts, such as Aristotle talks about putting on a festival to the gods, so paying for the theater, the processions, the sacrifices, or outfitting a trireme, outfitting a ship for the Navy. Sometimes private acts can be magnificent, such as putting on an enormous wedding feast. So the magnanimous man is also ready to rule in a good government in order to serve the common good, since, as Aristotle says, to do something to attain the end for one man is good, but to attain it for many is more godlike. So it's good to live a virtuous life. It's even better to rule, legislate, or teach others to lead virtuous lives. St. Thomas calls magnanimity a part of fortitude, so courage, that one of the cardinal virtues, because it has to do with willing and working for the difficult or arduous good. And it needs to enlist all the other virtues in its service. So one can't be magnanimous if one doesn't know what are the truly great deeds that are worthy of striving for. So one needs prudence to help one judge what goods to aspire to. The prudent person will recognize and wish to do virtuous acts and to pursue wisdom, beauty, worship of the divine. He will want to work for justice and peace. Magnanimity also, in a sense, works backwards on prudence, because the magnanimous man will judge difficult, great goods worthy of pursuit, worthy of choice. And that seems to be the way the virtues are all interconnected. One needs temperance to be magnanimous, since only the man who has his passions under control will be able to disdain the tug of desire for sensual pleasures, comfort, safety, wealth, in order to throw himself into the quest for the great and the beautiful. The sensual man is not even attracted by the great and noble good, much less ready to sacrifice his comforts and pleasures for them. The magnanimous man must also have the virtues of truthfulness and justice. In liberal democracies like ours, people tend to equate virtue with agreeableness and toleration, and justice with tyranny, or maybe a little bit papered over tyranny. But this is very far from the truth. It does not take magnanimity to be nice to everyone, to be tolerant, but it takes real courage to fight lies and injustice. Jesus did not mince words with the Pharisees. He called them hypocrites and whited sepulchres. He took a whip and beat the money changers out of the temple. So today, someone who calls abortion murder works to stop it, or who refuses to support calling gay unions marriages is in danger of scorn, fines, imprisonment, losing their job. So excessive interest in money, security, career would compromise a person's readiness to sacrifice all of them for something greater. One must not only wish to give everyone his due, but even be ready to forego what is due one for the sake of something great. So the magnanimous person forgives and forgets offenses. One definition of magnanimity says, magnanimity raises the possessor above revenge, makes him delight in acts of benevolence. It makes him disdain injustice and meanness. The magnanimous person must not seek his own benefit or his family's benefit to the extent of preferring it to justice or the common good. He will never flatter or keep silent out of self-interest, nor will he seek flattery. He would scorn honor that he doesn't deserve, and he would refuse to complain in adversity. Not a complainer, because he does not place his happiness in external goods. Therefore, he can forgive even great injuries and be benevolent to the point of sacrifice. If you Google magnanimity, one of the first definitions you will see is loftiness of spirit, enabling one to bear trouble calmly, to disdain meanness and pettiness, and to display a noble generosity. Very close to Aristotle. An older definition, greatness of mind, that elevation or dignity of soul, which encounters danger and trouble with tranquility and firmness. You see the relation to fortitude or courage, which raises the possessor above revenge. It makes him delight in acts of benevolence, which makes him disdain injustice and meanness, and prompts him to sacrifice personal ease, interest, and safety for the accomplishment of useful and noble objects. Perhaps most foreign to our age in this definition is the pursuit of noble objects, even to the extent of sacrifice. What are noble objects for the human race? Why should we honor those few who pursue them rather than their own comfort, security, wealth? Aristotle, as we heard from Dr. Plato, equates the noble life with a life of virtue and contemplation and service of God. And the ruler who legislates laws that promote virtue and a life of contemplation would be even greater. A later philosopher, a Platonist, Plotinus, also talks about contemplation. He says, "So one must go up again to the good, which every soul desires. If anyone saw it, what loves would he feel, what thirsts, wishing to be mingled together with it, how struck outside himself with joy. Here the greatest, the ultimate contest is set before souls. All toil being for the sake of this, not to be left without a share in the best vision, which if one attains it, one is blessed in seeing that blessed sight, and if one fails to attain it, one fails absolutely. One does not fail if one fails to win beauty of colors or bodies, or power or office or kingship even. But if one fails to win this, and only this, for which one should give up reaching kingship and rule over all earth and sea and sky, if only by leaving and overlooking them, one may turn to that and see." So what is one seeing? The divine, the good, the one, that above. So those are magnanimous pagans. Let's listen to a magnanimous Christian, magnanimous woman, Saint Therese of Lisieux. "To be thy spouse, O my Jesus, should not all this content me? And yet other vocations make themselves felt. I would spread the gospel to the ends of the earth, even to the most distant isles. I would be a missionary, not for a few years only, but were it possible from the beginning of the world to the consummation of time. Above all, I thirst for the martyr's crown. I do not sigh for one torment. I need them all to slake my thirst. Like thee, O adorable spouse, I would be scourged, I would be crucified, I would be flayed like St. Bartholomew, plunged into boiling oil like St. John, or like St. Ignatius of Antioch, ground by the teeth of wild beasts into a bread worthy of God. I would offer my neck to the sword of the executioner, and like Joan of Arc, I would murmur the name of Jesus at the stake." What great desires fill St. Therese's great heart. And yet, people raised in our culture would probably not admire her desire to die 1,000 deaths for Christ. They might well find it fanatical and stupid. Indeed, anyone who believes in nothing but the material universe has a hard time finding something great to live for. Materialists usually end up living for pleasure and comfort. Magnanimity is not a virtue much appreciated by citizens of a liberal democracy, particularly not one that has become increasingly materialistic. Personal autonomy has become the highest value. Each should be able to choose whatever end they wish to pursue for themselves. The state simply prevents citizens from hurting each other or encroaching on other people's rights in their pursuit. There's no objective good or evil, no human nature that can be fulfilled by certain activities and harmed by others. In the absence of a shared understanding of what are the greatest goods for persons, fallen humans tend to pursue the most obvious goods of pleasure, comfort, wealth, security. Indeed, massive propaganda from advertisers in the media urge people to try to stay young and fit as long as possible, be wealthy so they can enjoy sex, sports, rock music, fast cars, and travel. The result is people never want to be alone or quiet. They instinctively fear the silence that might allow them to discover the emptiness of their poor, shrunken hearts. Sometimes materials live for helping others, but what can they help others to have other than health, comfort, pleasure, and security? If one values nothing noble, one can work for nothing noble for others. Although it is certainly more admirable to work for the health and comfort of others than just for oneself. One can see that people long to admire someone great, but whom do they find to admire? Most often movie stars, sports heroes, successful entrepreneurs. They admire wealth, success, fame, sometimes people who are willing to make great risks for glory, like solo mountain climbers or other extreme sports athletes. Rarely are they touched by truly great humans. Mother Teresa, perhaps, and John Paul II are exceptions. This leads to some questions, I think, for a Christian. Can one really distinguish between the virtue of love or charity and magnanimity? So the virtues are connected, but when we heard the words of Saint Therese, that seemed like the words of great charity. So how is that different from magnanimity? I would want to say the root of all Christian virtues is charity. So that becomes the connector for a Christian who has supernatural grace, that St. Thomas would call charity the form of all the virtues. All of them have to spring in some way from it. So the great desires of magnanimity flow from charity, yet one can still distinguish the virtues by the power that they perfect. So certain virtues are principally of the intellect, like prudence, wisdom. Others are principally of the will, like charity and hope. Some are perfection of the sensual appetite, like temperance, and others of the irascible or anger appetite, like fortitude. So since magnanimity is a part of fortitude, it's a perfection of that irascible appetite that deals with the difficult. And in that way, it's different from love, although it stems from love. It's a particular readiness to face the difficult, to do what is very arduous for the sake of this love, of what's great. So it's because one has a great love for justice, for the good, the true, the beautiful, for God, that one has such powerful desires to do great and difficult things for him. One can do everything that one does out of great love. One can be a saint while washing dishes, but there still is a difference between washing dishes and going on a crusade. One can be a great saint because one does all that one does out of great love, yet there are goods and activities that are objectively grander. It's a greater thing. The church is always taught to follow the counsels of perfection and vow poverty, chastity, and obedience than to live as a virtuous married person. It's a greater thing to choose to be a missionary, like the French Jesuits who came to North America to bring the gospel to the Native Americans and had their fingers bitten off and were martyred, than to teach, for instance, in a seminary, or to be a parish priest back in civilized France. So then one wonders, does God call some people to greater deeds? I think we would have to say yes, that some people are objectively called to greater deeds than others, and some people refuse that call, like the rich young man in the gospel. Are some people born with a greater natural inclination to magnanimity? So this is the same question about these inborn virtues. Are they virtues? Is there an inborn inclination to magnanimity? Yes, I think so. Just as some are born courageous or timid, tempered or greedy, some are born with a much greater desire to do great things. But these natural inborn virtues are not yet an ethical or supernatural virtue. It has to be developed. It has to be under the direction of the will and the reason to become a true virtue. However, I think they can make it easier to acquire the virtues, to have these inborn virtues. If you're born more temperate, then I think it's easier to acquire the virtue of temperance. If you're born with a great heart, desiring very risk-friendly, always trying to do difficult things, it's easier to acquire the supernatural virtue of magnanimity. And parents and teachers can encourage all virtues, but they can encourage the virtue of magnanimity by reading, telling stories of great heroes and saints, training their children to appreciate beauty in all its forms and to scorn the ugly and the trite. They can teach them to disdain all untruthfulness, meanness of heart, chasing after money. They can relate, talk to them about characters and stories or people that they meet who betray a friend or family for the sake of their career. Most of all, parents can teach their children magnanimity, of course, by living it. If they make great sacrifices for Christ, if they give up safe, well-paid careers to do work they feel called to do for Christ, go to prison for sitting in front of an abortion center, they can teach their child what it means to have greatness of heart. I have only a few seconds, but I wanted to say joy is also connected to magnanimity. Joy follows from love. When we love, we rejoice in the goodness of the one we love. And from this joy in love comes the strength to do great deeds for the one we love. So Joseph Pieper says, the bravery of a Christian thrives on the hope and life's abundance of reality, an eternal life and a new heaven and a new earth. So the magnanimous person dares all to gain all because he loves Christ enough and trusts him enough to believe in his great promises. And his joy and this trust in God gives him the desire to do these great things.